Did you know that Iceland is one of the few countries in the world that doesn't have mosquitoes? Iceland's climate changes so quickly that mosquitoes do not have enough time to complete their life cycles. We'll discuss this and other interesting facts about travel with podcaster Don Mirra on this episode of The Curious Professor. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome to the Curious Professor podcast, where I take listeners on a journey of discovery to explore the people, places, artifacts, and natural wonders that spark my curiosity. On this episode of the Curious Professor podcast, we'll explore traveler's art with podcaster Don Mirra. But first, a trivia question. How long is the shortest commercial flight in the world? I'll have the answer for you at the end of this episode. I'm thrilled to have Don Mirra on the show today. Don was born in Nuremberg, Germany, to American parents with heritage ties to Scotland and Sicily. Don began as a photojournalist, focusing on overlooked social issues, often immersing himself in the country and culture of his subjects to find the deeper story. Having traveled to over 68 nations, his appreciation of diverse cultures began the process of understanding why we do what we do and what that means to the greater story of our personal lives. Don has been interviewed on multiple podcasts, and after much deliberation, started his own podcast, The Traveler's Art, in 2020. When I learned about Don's extensive travels, my curiosity was immediately piqued and I wanted to learn more. I hope this interview with Don will spark your curiosity too. Welcome to the show, Don. It's great to have you here.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate it.
What's the most important thing I should know about you?
That I speak in tangents at times. And if you get lost, just ask me to go back because I sometimes can, as they say down under, I can lose the plot.
Okay, what is the difference between a traveler and a tourist?
Well, I think there's some common ground, but the differences are subtle yet significant. And we, as a traveler or a tourist, pretty much we're leaving our kind of domestic domicile and we're moving into another either cultural or geographic or some other type of space. But there's a great way to kind of, as a general rule, say I'm either a tourist or a traveler, and that is that tourists count down and a traveler counts up because they just don't know when they're going to return. Tourists have fast itineraries. It's very smashed in, 7 cathedrals in 7 days, kind of an idea, 9 islands in 9 days, right? Whereas a traveler, they take their time. They might stay in the city of Florence for 2 weeks and just walk the streets. No guided tour, they just experience. As a tourist, we have a very specific agenda. We want to see certain things. We're in many ways, as a tourist, we're somewhat of a consumer. Whereas as a traveler, in anthropology, they called it, in anthropology, it's known as a participant observer. And that's more like a traveler. So as a traveler, we seek to grow and change. As a tourist, we tend to want to be entertained in a different venue. And so I don't have issue with either one of those. What I do have issue with is when people confuse them or they make them the same, and it's not. It's they're subtle, highly significantly different, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And do you consider yourself then more of a traveler?
Yes, I would definitely say I'm a traveler. I've probably spent close to half my life in some way or fashion on the road. I would probably also say that I do enjoy some tourist activities, right? You just can't get around it. Like the pyramids of Giza, they're just cool, regardless if you're a tourist or a traveler, they're just cool. And so you can't get around that. Or, Machu Picchu, you just can't get around that. Now, as the world of travel has opened up more and more, we've also seen less and less travelers and more tourists. I'm going to do a yoga retreat and see Machu Picchu. I'm like, okay, that's a lot though. I kind of have a philosophy of When you rush, you risk. If you have a rushed itinerary, you're risking really seeing the deeper story and the deeper meaning. And so, consequently, in a world which is so immediate gratification, in a world where infinite scroll and micro dopamine hits, it's this type of travel is very antithetical to what is the standard narrative today.
Well, and I feel like people are so anxious to get that selfie for Instagram that they miss what is actually happening right in front of them.
Absolutely. So I used to teach photography to private clients, and I learned photography shooting film with my grandfather. And the first thing I did with all of my students is I took a piece of black gaffer's tape, which is like a special type of like duct tape in a way, right? It's used for mainly in film. They use this black tape so it doesn't reflect or show up during the movie. And I'd just take a piece of that black tape and I'd throw it on the back of their preview screen on their camera and say, if you don't see it in your head, you're certainly not going to see it in that camera. And so they stop what we call chimping the camera. They look like a little chimpanzee looking at their photos. And the same thing goes with life. Like you're not going to find much on that little handheld device that's really going to enrich your life as much as standing in front of a cantina in Tulum, Mexico, or waiting for a bus in Peru, or the ferry to get from one island to another in the Philippines. The world is outside that small little screen. And the truth is, that screen is rigged against you. It will hijack your life. It will hijack your experience. I just did a podcast, the latest Travelers Art Coffee, exactly on the topic of social media and posting. And I've been a surfer for pretty much most of my life. And there's always this saying of the secret spot. And the reason why it's a secret is you don't tell anybody. And today, because of our natural cultural normality of narcissism and the see me world, people have to share to be validated because their life is so alone. They don't know how to be alone. If they're standing in line, oh, I'm micro bored. I'm going to scroll and look at something. When was the last time you looked at the cashier and look them in the eye and say, thank you for your work? I can tell you now, I was in a small island and the cashier checked me out and I said, that was very kind. Could you recommend a place for lunch? And they said, oh yeah, just go down the street, turn left, and ask for the chicken and rice meal. That was the best meal I had in like 2 weeks. If I'd been stuck on my phone and in my own head, strategizing how I can now get like paid to play, I'm going to miss out, right? Everybody assumes and acts like they're going to live forever. And the truth is we're not. The clock is ticking. The enrichment of our life is never found through that device. It's found through interaction and social covenants between us and other humans.
And how does this connect with your idea of transformational travel?
The way that this connects to transformational travel is that a transformational experience is usually not very entertaining. In fact, it might be challenging. There's a great saying, if it doesn't challenge you, it won't change you. And you can't challenge your perspectives. You can't challenge your priorities if you're bearing your eyes on that little illuminated device all the time. And literally, the cocaine addiction is almost identical to social media addiction. I mean, the dopamine deficiencies that people go through, the boredom and anxiety they experience is not real. It's a false positive. What's going on is you're going through dopamine withdrawal, just like cocaine. So to have a transformational experience, we need to be present. We need to be here. We need to be now. I mean, I'm waiting for the day when somebody says, yeah, I just scroll while I have sex. I mean, talk about tragic, but in many ways, you could take the sex, that noun out and replace it with something else, and the process is identical. So transformational travel happens when we're present. Our eyes are fixated forward. Our eyes are fixated up. Our eyes are fixated on other eyes as we watch someone's face and their lips. 80% of our communication is nonverbal. If we're checked out, we're missing out.
And so why do you believe that travel is vital today?
Well, reality is defined by experience. So the breadth of your reality is defined by the breadth of your experience. You can't know what you don't know. So experience gives us a reshaping and a almost a recalibration of perspective. Every time I move around that compass rose of perspective as a metaphor, I'm learning more about myself, my own culture, my own values. And so without a change in perspective, I am essentially in a state of monodimensional reality. Until you've had a 3.5 hour lunch in Madrid, Spain, or in Barcelona or in Cartagena, you won't know that that's a better lunch than 30 minutes, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Or the fact that, when you go to some of the smaller islands in the world, you realize you don't need all that stuff that somehow we've been sold is so important. When we experience brutal cold like Lake Baikal in Russia, we realize that's a new benchmark for cold. So our perspectives create our realities. So the size of our reality is dependent on the diversification of experiences. In essence, we travel without knowing it to have new experiences. If our life is very stressful, I'm a corporate attorney, or I carry a tremendous amount of social responsibility, then usually when I'm going to go travel somewhere as a tourist, I just want to stop and relax. Well, I'm going to propose the idea, maybe there's a lifestyle change that needs to happen, because you're not going to live forever. And ultimately, none of us are really that important. I mean, unless you're working on cold fusion, women's rights worldwide, or really involved medical problems, most of us are not going to contribute much. We're more going to take than we give.
You've stated that travels begin before we leave home. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think this goes back to the concept of, I'm very much curate your own trip. So you do your research. You have to find out what's really important to you, not what other people do. What other people do is their business. It's none of your business. If somebody says, oh, Fiji was great. Is it? Is it really? Well, I guess, a 4-star resort at Fiji is going to be great, but a 4-star resort is the same wherever you go. It's a 4-star experience. But what is the outskirts of Fiji like? What's it like in the villages where they live in a grass hut? Because people do. And so I believe that you want to curate your trip because you need to find out what's really important to you. Because the point is, you're putting all this time and all of this money, and you're flying a far distance or taking a long train ride to have this experience. It's important that it's based on your priorities, your research. So the actual journey of, say, seeing the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places on earth, okay? It begins with, why do I want to go there? Am I just interested in deserts? Or if I'm into ruins, maybe I'll plan a trip to Pompeii, and I'll plan a trip to see the Etruscan ruins in Tunisia. I'm going to do these 2 places. The journey actually begins before I even leave. It's the research process. It's poring over maps. It's poring through books. It's finding out where not to go. Like, it was so great to go there. Like, if you're finding advice on TripAdvisor, that's probably a red flag. Okay. And the internet has made the world quite small. And a lot of the mystery, the very reason to travel, has sadly been stolen from us, from groups and people that just can't keep their mouths shut, and they focus on the wrong thing. Real travel, the travel that has transformation, is very seldom found in monuments, but rather monumental moments in the back streets and alleys, from the woman that serves you a coffee, to the man that cleans the cathedral, to the taxi driver who takes you to the really great sunset spot and he shares a bottle of wine with you. That is where real travel is found, where transformation takes root.
Yeah, I've found in my travels, some of the most noteworthy experiences I've had have been conversations with people in those countries, and really learning about what the day-to-day life is like for them, and what their experiences have been living in a country that's different from my own.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's the ability to converse with a stranger is who we are. Talking to strangers is really who we are as a species. And I think we really need to take a step back and realize that when you get close to the end of your life, if you are lucky enough to know when it's coming, you're not going to be looking back saying, gee, I wish I got more screen time, right?
Or I wish I could have worked some more.
Yeah. Well, that's a topic I could unpack ad nauseum. The myth that is, we're just pushed so many myths, and they ultimately make us so damn unhappy. I've played a game a few times with people. I have I have 15 poker chips, and they're numbered 1 through 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I put it in a bag. And I tell this person, pull that chip out. Just pick one. So you don't know. And let's say they pick up 3. They pick a number 3. I say, okay, great. You got 3 weeks to live. What's your most important things you're going to do for 3 weeks? You get 3 minutes to decide. And then I say, okay, great. Time's up. Time's up. Time's up. No more writing, no more thinking, no more talking. Okay, great. But now you get 3 months. Now what are you going to do? Okay, now you get 3 years. And what's really interesting is how the difference between 3 weeks to 3 months changes pretty, okay, there's a lot more in there, but from 3 months to 3 years, the changes aren't that drastic. And then I ask them, so why aren't you doing those things right now? Because you make the assumption that you're going to live till you're really old, and that may not happen. In my podcast, Under Intentions, which is a short little 7-minute podcast, I talk about how important it is to really realize that the way that you truly live is to understand that death is imminent. Unlike the Apollo space missions, we don't come back to Earth or come into Earth with parachutes landing in the water. We burn up on reentry and we die. And I think the sooner we start accepting that and bringing death closer to us, the more we are alive, because we will not squander our time on the meaningless, trivial, and ultimately counterfeit. Instead, we'll focus on what is valuable. The famous psychotherapist, Esther Perel, who really focuses on relationships and love. And, you know, she was interviewed recently and asked, well, what's the most important things to you? What's like a good day for you? Great, meaningful friends and conversation with really phenomenal food. I was like, you know, that's been something we've been doing for about 100,000 years. I think she's got it right, you know?
Yeah, that's great.
And this same thing goes when we travel. That's what's fascinating. When you ask questions, I've never gotten a good meal from a guidebook, or certainly not the internet. I get it from, hey, this is my last day in Sardinia. Where do you recommend to have a really good seafood meal? Oh, you want to go here. And there you go. That it's so simple. Everybody makes it so complicated. The reality is it's through people that we really, really experience, because all those monuments were made by someone at some point.
So what's the most interesting place you've traveled so far?
Ooh, I guess that would kind of depend. You know, I think it ends up being, people ask me, well, where's the best place to eat? What's the best food you've had? I say, well, that depends. You know, if you like European food, like, of course, Italy and Spain has great food, you know, but I kind of like Southeast Asian food. I love the spice and the diversification. Lemongrass, oh, that's so good. One of the most interesting places I've been, I would probably say, not necessarily a place, but cultures that are still, I don't want to say antiquated or from antiquity, but really hold their deeper survival roots, how we survived. You know, culture is a survival mechanism. And culture eats logic for breakfast. And then you see some very, very interesting cultural traditions. But that's a tough question. Not many people have really asked me that one. They ask me, I would probably say, probably one of the most sculpting experiences I had was being in Myanmar or Burma 21 years ago, when the junta was still very, very active. Getting into the country was almost impossible. And I walked around in Mandalay through the night markets and went to Bagan, the land of 10,000 stupas, and spent time with those people. And it also launched my photo career. That was one of the reasons why. But it was a very powerful experience to be in another world, another culture that hadn't really changed in a long time. And their traditions were so foreign to kind of a standard Westerner, so to speak, you know? I mean, it really, really was fascinating. Nothing was what I was used to.
Do you think that's a place? Sorry. Do you think that's a place that you would like to return to see what's changed?
You know, that's a really good question, because the same year that I went to Myanmar, I went to Cambodia. And this is before Tomb Raider and all the other media moguls went there. I mean, I walked the temples of Angkor Wat, like Angkor Bayon and Angkor Thom, by myself. I saw maybe 12 people the entire week I was at Angkor Wat. I did 2 trips on that one trip. I ended up leaving and going to Batam, Batum Bong, I think it's called. And I was like, oh, this is kind of cool, but I want to go back to the temples. I'm similar to my grandmother, who really enjoys ruins, right? And lost and civilizations that have ended have always fascinated me. And so I went there 21 years ago, and 6 years ago, I went back to Cambodia, and it was very difficult. I remember when I went the first time to Cambodia, I was going down the main road going into the primary temple, and the cicadas were so loud it almost felt like they were vibrating your skin, you know. And as we're going down the road, suddenly there was this line of at least a dozen, maybe more, of elephants carrying these stones or logs in their trunks, and just walking down the road. I was like, wow, the trees were different. And then I saw that first primary temple. And as we turned left, you could see the still water surrounding the temple. And I just started crying. I thought, how could my species make this? It's like I was beyond words. And I'm walking through this temple with like two other people. And I'm just like, this is unbelievable. And then 6 years ago when I went, I wept again. But this was because there must have been 25,000 tourists walking around taking selfies and walking around with their matching shirts and matching flag, busloads of people. And I thought, oh my God, they're doing selfies. There were selfie platforms. I thought, this is a sacred site. And now it's become nothing more than an Instagram background. It's a Hollywood experience. It's a see me. It's not ethnic travel. It's ego travel. Well, I've been, and that makes me more important, or I have value. No, you just spent money. And so to go back to Myanmar, I'm scared in a way. I went on a train ride from Mandalay to Bagan, and that will live in my mind forever. Forever. That was amazing. It was the same train that the British had been using when they were colonialists there. Yeah, at one point that the car was rocking to the left and right so much, I almost thought it was going to tip over. I was terrified. When the train was on and running, there was electricity. When it stopped, all the electricity went off. I was like, well, there you have it. I mean, wow. I had a first class cabin or area, which meant I had padding on a picnic table bench. And that was first class, right? It was, getting into Bagan, it was psychedelic. But I guess I would go back, but I would be going back with a bit of a tenuous position, so to speak. I'd be a little worried. But I would love to go back to Bagan. In my podcast, it's a 2-part series called Assume It's Your Last Trip. And one of them is about being in Bagan, which I recommend that trip. I recommend those 2 podcasts without reservation. It's a 2-part series, and both of them I think, have a wonderful ethos and is very humbling to revisit those experiences and share how I had failed and then how I had succeeded. But ultimately that both of them gave me a learning experience that transformed my character.
Well, my next question is, what are ways in which travelers fail?
Well, I think failure is going to be somewhat relative to our own interest and agenda. The way that travelers ultimately fail is they're not thinking about what really is important to them, and what they're doing is what's important to other people. Because all of our other failures are the downstream effect of that corrupt inception of why I want to travel. So a really good point would be, if you're really into fishing, why not go on a fishing trip? Like, go fish in the fjords of New Zealand or the rivers of Tanzania, and not worry about the fact that people are going on these expensive boat trips. You do what you want, do what has value to you. And I think that is the first way that we fail. The second way that travelers fail is they don't keep a daily journal. A journal becomes a time machine. I still have my little journal I kept in Cambodia from 21 years ago. It's priceless. It is so priceless, because I can't remember all that detail. That's just not how the human brain works. But when I read that journal, oh, wow, suddenly I'm having like cellular memories of odors and flavors. And those little symbols called letters and words suddenly bring back emotional experiences that transcend time. It ends up becoming a time machine. That's the second way we fail as travelers. The third way that we can fail as travelers is to pontificate on our travel experience to other people who ultimately have no connection. The best way to share your travel experiences is to change how you live, what your values are. That's the ultimate testament to your travel experience and ultimately a testament to your own transformation.
So, what was your most inspiring travel story?
I would probably say the certainly the trip to Bagan was in the top two or three. It's really hard to choose just one. I did a long trip in Central America that taught me a lot about what it means to have community, to work together, to have a simple life. That just because you're poor, that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. You're just poor. You still could be highly literate and highly intelligent. Just money hasn't come your way. That was definitely quite transformative. Yeah, those are probably the two big ones. It's hard because over time, a lot of my travel experiences become more of a philosophical viewpoint and a sculpting of perspective. I mean, that's why I started the Traveler's Art podcast, was because I think people are missing out. Bucket list is nothing more than a repackaged version of blind consumerism and self-indulgent behavior. There's no need for a bucket list. No, there's no list. I like architecture. I'm doing an architectural tour of Quebec. I'm going to do it myself, and I'm going to listen to classical during the time period that those buildings were made. I'm going to learn about the architect. I'm going to learn why it has value. And then that comes back to me because I am a developer and I care about architecture. That's real travel. Well, I'm really into food, right? I mean, if you're inspired by Anthony Bourdain's travels, that's interesting. And the food's interesting, but you notice it's never really about the food. It's about that person that made that food. That's who we're talking about. They're not down there with microscopes and probes talking about food. It's about people make food. The downstream effort of someone's cooking is the food, and the upstream is who that person is.
And
I think that's where
the community that's built around the act of eating that food, who that food brings together to enjoy
so
it.
well said. So well said. Absolutely. I did a podcast on lessons in the van when I had a 1978 VW camper van. And I learned so much from this one man and his whole community about community, all centered around a fish. Something as simple as buying a fish from a fisherman could just like blow your mind. I really feel, especially now, Johan Hari, who wrote the book Missed Connections, I think, he gave a TED talk, and he talks about why we are so sad, depressed. And the truth is we're really lonely. I mean, we are confusing contact with connection. Contact is thinking of you in a text message or where are you? That's not connection. Connection is calling someone on the phone. Connection is writing a heartfelt letter, which is different than an email. When you're touching something, we're tactile creatures. I mean, when babies are born premature and they're in an incubator, there are people that literally come in and just touch the child. Why? Because they'll fail to thrive and they'll die without touch. It wasn't that long ago we lived in caves. And in addition, we are more related to bonobo chimpanzees than an African elephant is to an Indian elephant. And when you watch bonobos interact, they touch each other on average 12,000 times a day. The average human being gets touched no more than 400. And so we suffer from a lack of real connection. We suffer from a lack of touch. And one of the beautiful things when you travel to Greece is that people touch you. When you travel in parts of Africa, they hold your hand when they talk to you. This is who we are. That's why travel is not about sights, but about seeing.
And so, what's ahead for you? What are you most excited about right now?
Well, I'm really excited about. I've got 3 new podcasts that are been outlined and in the pipeline, which are very difficult stories to tell because they're complicated and it takes a lot of time. But I love telling those stories, and I have a few trips that I'm really interested in doing. I'm a very avid scuba diver. I've been diving since. Ooh, wow, that'd be like, oh gosh, I've been diving for like 30 years. I didn't realize. I'm getting old. I love being underwater. That's a time machine. Not many new species evolution underwater. I dove actually in Indonesia during the pandemic in a place called Tomia Island in the Wakatobi archipelago. And Jacques Cousteau called it the most beautiful place he's ever dove in his life. And when I got in the water, I went, yeah, no kidding. Wow. I saw a barrel sponge that was the size of an average minivan. It was so big. And that species is 350 million years old, and it's not a plant, it's an animal. And so I'm really hoping that the Philippines open up because I'm very interested in diving at some of the key wrecks in Cebu. I'm also interested in getting into Sri Lanka. Just waiting for the world to kind of stabilize a little bit more, where the travel concerns and the travel regulations have become more stabilized and in some ways more intelligent. But I think those are probably the highlights coming up: more diving, more podcasting. And of course, I'm really keen to get back to Indonesia for the surf season because the surf there is the stuff of dreams.
And is there anything else you'd like to tell us about you or your work?
Well, to be honest, I really hope that more and more people will dive into Traveler's Art podcast and email me, because I answer every email and message I get personally. Nothing gets put into some kind of aggregate hopper. I don't have an assistant who writes nicely crafted go away letters, as I call them. And I really hope that people can challenge themselves to rethink how they think about traveling and tourism, and knowing that you can't see it all. And that's a good thing. And even if you went tons of places, by the time you go back, like I did to Cambodia, it's going to be different anyway. That's why the bucket list is such a fallacy. That what really matters is that you are where you are because you chose to be there on your philosophical position. I mean, ultimately, the podcast is about the philosophy of travel, going in deeper to really understand what happens. And I really hope that people will listen to it, email me, because I publish people's voice messages to me, and I'm emailing questions now, answering quite a lot of Travelers Art Coffee questions, because I believe that no one of us knows as much as all of us, and that the humble approach of treading lightly upon the earth and honoring the cultures that we encounter, I think that's kind of the last great exploration. Because Wade Davis, who is an ethnographer and anthropologist, cultures are dying every week. Could you imagine the love songs that are in Portuguese never to be sung again because that language dies?
And where can listeners find out more about you?
Well, I have a website called thetravelersart.com, but the real active platform is the podcast by the same name. And that's been syndicated throughout the entire podcasting world. If someone looks for it on a podcasting platform and I'm not there, let me know. I'll install the RSS feed, no problem. But that's the best way, is really through that podcast. And then the website has email connections, and that's also the travelersart@gmail.com. Super easy.
Great.
And it's pretty much everywhere. My hope is that people really engage in the material. And I could be wrong. So if you think I'm full of shit, let me know. Let's dialogue about it, right? I mean, I could be wrong. God, I've been wrong before, Being right all the time is a lonely place.
I wouldn't know. I'm hardly ever right.
Oh.
It was great to have you on the show, Don. Thank you so much for taking time to be a guest on the Curious Professor podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I really, really appreciate sharing with all of your listeners and you. It's been an honor and a privilege.
And now for the answer to this episode's trivia question. How long is the shortest commercial flight in the world? The shortest commercial flight in the world is the air route between two of the Orkney Islands, Westray and Papa Westray in Scotland. The distance is only 1.7 miles and the flight lasts less than 2 minutes. We'll end the show with something punny. Where do sharks love to go on vacation? Finland. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. If there's a person, place, artifact, or natural wonder that has sparked your curiosity and you'd like for me to feature it on the show, please let me know. My website is thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to the Curious Professor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to become part of my community of curiosity seekers, be sure to visit my website, thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com, and join Dr. B's Hive. Until next time, always be learning and be curious with Dr. B.